Calderon, presently there is $1.25 billion of two-way trade daily and 1 million legal border crossings daily between the two countries. What do you think that Mexico and the United States need to do to increase those two numbers even more?
Well, that's a very important point. Today we are only exporting 1 billion a day. 1 billion a day, which is a tremendous engine for Mexican economy. And of course, the trade relationship with the United States is so important in that, and those figures are quite impressive. First, we need to increase the infrastructure in the border, clearly. Let me tell you that we are building today a train connection between Matamoros and Bronzeville. But what is curious is the first train connection in 100 years between the United States and Mexico. So we need to understand, and probably more important than infrastructure itself, is that we need to persuade our people, both sides of the border, that trade means jobs and economic growth for our people, not only for Mexican people. We need to persuade it that to the Americans that Mexican are the most important buyers of American products in the world. Actually, we are buying much more than the Chinese, for instance. Probably we are following the Canadian, but Mexican consumers are creating millions of American jobs. Of course, the other way around, but we need to understand that trade is not a threat for anyone. Trade is a tremendous opportunity for economic growth. If we persuade our people and we understand how important is freedom and trade, I'm very sure will improve the conditions of trade between the United States and Mexico. And of course, there are another more specific points. For instance, we need to homologate some requirements. We need to reduce red tape between both countries. We need to erase some parts of the process to cross the border. And we need to establish the same standards in terms of the quality for consumers and the quality of the products and several things that we are trying to put in place.
Since the year 2000, U.S. companies have invested over $145 billion in Mexico, which is an impressive number, whichever way one cuts it. With drug volumes increasing in Mexico, it has become a concern for U.S. companies' investment in tourism. Nevertheless, your leadership and administration has been on the forefront in taking bold action against cartels and the drug industry. Could you describe some of the innovative and successful programs you have executed as President of Mexico, and how have you strengthened security and the rule of law, since analysts across the board have basically extolled and commended your impressive efforts and, most importantly, your results?
One thing that is very important for me to explain is our main goal, our aim, is not drugs themselves. Our main goal is to establish the rule of law in Mexico plenty. I understand that if you have not a clear rule of law system, you won't have progress and you won't have prosperity for your people. That's the idea. So there is not some kind of like obsession against drug or consumers or addicts. It's a problem with the law. And in that sense, we are putting in place a comprehensive strategy. First, what we are doing is prosecuting and fighting the criminals, which is obvious. The problem is for some people that was a mistake. Why? Because probably in a very old perspective, coming from some kind of culture in which corruption has some kind of tolerable levels. I don't agree with that, but for some people, that's the idea. For them, the mistake of my government was to fight the criminals, and it's the other way around. The mistake that Mexico had by several years was to allow the criminals to take over the power in towns and cities and regions. So the first part of the strategy is fighting the criminals. Second, and more important part of the strategy is to reinforce the law enforcement agencies. So in that sense, talking about innovative process, for instance, we established first as regulatory for the federal government, but after that we passed a law in the Congress for that. We are establishing a special process in which any single new member of the police corps must be vetted for by special agencies. And at the same time, in order to be in the police corps, you need to be vetted, for instance, once a year or probably once every 2 years. So in that sense, we are cleaning up the police corps and fighting the corruption, which is the cancer in the Mexican institutions. Of course, it's a long-term process and it's very painful and there are a lot of risks, but you must do that. Without that, you never will have reliable institutions. And the third part, and even more important, of the strategy is to rebuild social fabric, because Mexico is blessed by the fact that we are a very young population. You can imagine that half of the people in Mexico have 26 years old or is 26 years old or younger, which is a tremendous opportunity. But at the same time, it's a challenge that you cannot imagine. So in that sense, we are providing, and thank you for your comment, Kate, but we have built 140 new universities, public and free tuition universities. And with that, for instance, we are, in Mexico, there are 113,000 new engineers every single year graduating. And of course, this situation is providing new social conditions and new social opportunities for kids, but at the same time, it's provoking an advantage in economic terms. Why? Because it's providing a lot of competitiveness for our industry. Mexico became, in these years, a clear competitor to China, for instance. And we are not competing for very low salaries. We are not interested in that. We are competing with our engineers. We are competing with infrastructure. We are competing with a very aggressive deregulation process that we did. We erased in 2010 16,000 rules at federal level. Yes, I told my team, please forget all those rules that you cannot even remember today. And that's it. And with that, competitiveness in Mexico increased dramatically. For instance, when I took office, Mexico was the 9th largest exporter of vehicles in the world. Today, we are the 4th largest exporter of vehicles and advancing. And that implies, for instance, a lot of advantage, not only for Mexican companies, but also for any global company. And there are a lot of American companies. And the question is, does that situation imply a disadvantage for American workers? Absolutely not. Because as long as those companies are successful in a global context, they are providing more capacities and they are being stronger for their own roots here in the American society. And in that sense, we are increasing dramatically our productivity, and despite the fact that there is a problem that we are facing, addressing, and solving, fixing, which is security issues. We are in a very long process, but we are on track on that. We are receiving, as you say, more than $100 billion in foreign direct investment, and most of them is American investment.